A white police officer weaves a web of lies in court, targeting a black woman unaware that she is a living legend, a high-ranking Navy SEAL officer. "You underestimated me, Officer Reynolds," she declares coldly. But the truth always finds a way to surface. What leaves an entire courtroom stunned into silence. He accuses her of resisting arrest and assault, a seemingly airtight story, until she takes the witness stand and dismantles everything with a truth as sharp as a blade. Who is she? And what about her testimony makes the officer tremble, the jury reel, and even the judge unable to stay composed? This is the gripping tale of a lie unraveling, where a fight for justice transforms into a battle for truth. Get ready to uncover the secret behind the case that shocked everyone. The courtroom was heavy, almost suffocating, filled with a tension that weighed down the very air. Dozens of faces filled the wooden pews, locals whispering among themselves, journalists scribbling hurried notes, and a handful of grim spectators. In the center of it all sat Maya Thompson, her expression composed, betraying nothing of the storm churning beneath her skin. Maya's dark skin caught the cold gleam of the overhead lights, her black hair braided neatly and tucked over one shoulder. She wore a plain, light gray blouse, tucked into dark slacks, modest, deliberate, a statement of respect and resilience rather than defiance. Her posture was perfect, upright and poised, every inch of her presence a quiet refusal to be diminished. To the casual observer, she might have seemed just another defendant awaiting judgment, but for those who looked closer, there was something about her, a stillness too controlled, an awareness too sharp that suggested this was no ordinary case. At the front of the courtroom, the door opened with a low groan, and the bailiff called out, "All rise." In strode Judge Raymond Holloway, a silver-haired man with a lined face and the tired eyes of someone who had seen too many broken lives pass through his courtroom. Yet today, a flicker of curiosity sharpened his gaze, the kind that only came with cases whispered about even before they reached the docket. This one had already captured headlines. The case of the state of Georgia versus Maya Thompson. As Maya stood, the murmur of the courtroom swelled, heads craned for a better look, the weight of collective judgment pressing in. Across the room, Officer Daniel Reynolds adjusted his uniform with an almost theatrical precision, a faint smirk playing on his lips as he settled at the plaintiff's table. Confidence radiated from him, the smug kind born from years of unchecked authority. At Maya's side, Andrew Lewis, her defense attorney, young, still carrying the sheen of newly minted law school ambition, fumbled nervously through his notes. He threw her a quick glance, seeking some unspoken reassurance. Maya did not return it. Her gaze stayed locked forward, unflinching. Andrew rose on shaky legs. "Your Honor," he began, voice cracking slightly. "The defense is ready to proceed." Judge Holloway nodded, gesturing toward the prosecution. "Officer Reynolds, please take the stand." Reynolds rose smoothly, adjusting his tie as he approached the witness stand, every step calculated, as if he were stepping onto a stage rather than into a sworn oath. As he passed Maya, he glanced sideways at her, a tiny, condescending flicker of a smirk, a wolf sure of an easy kill. Maya didn't move. She simply watched the slight twitch in his hand, the tightening at his jawline. Details most would miss, but not her. The oath was administered, and Reynolds lowered himself into the witness chair with the casual arrogance of someone who had done this dance before. When responding to a disturbance call, Reynolds began, voice loud, clear, and practiced. "I encountered the defendant loitering suspiciously outside a closed storefront along Jefferson Avenue. A few low murmurs rippled through the room. A black woman, accused of loitering, a familiar, tired song. I approached politely." Reynolds continued, "Asked her for identification. She became aggressive, raised her voice, and when I attempted to calm her down, she struck me in the chest." Gasps fluttered across the gallery like startled birds. Furthermore, Reynolds added solemnly, "The defendant attempted to reach for my sidearm. At that point, I had no choice but to restrain her." Maya remained motionless, expression unreadable, as the courtroom reacted, some whispering, some frowning, a few shaking their heads. At the plaintiff's table, Reynolds exhaled slowly, as if shedding the burden of truth-telling. Except Maya knew, and he knew truth had never entered the building. Judge Holloway leaned forward slightly. "Thank you, Officer Reynolds," he said neutrally. "You may step down." As Reynolds returned to his seat, exchanging subtle glances with his fellow officers seated along the back wall, Maya could feel it, the silent weight of prejudice, thicker than the walls around her. Her attorney, Andrew Lewis, rose again, visibly rattled. "Your Honor," he began, voice cracking. "Before we proceed, I'd like to motion, save it for cross-examination. Mr. Lewis." The judge cut him off sharply. "Let's move along." Maya exhaled slowly a breath to center herself. She leaned toward Andrew, her voice a barely audible whisper. "Stay calm. Stick to the facts." Andrew swallowed, gave a tiny nod, but the nervous twitch in his hands told her this would be no easy road. As the prosecution rested its case, the atmosphere thickened, oppressive. All eyes turned toward Maya, the woman in the gray blouse who had been accused of violence, of defiance, of something far worse. Judge Holloway's voice cut through the heavy silence. "Ms. Thompson, it's your turn." Maya stood, smoothing the fabric of her blouse. She stepped toward the witness stand, each step measured, each breath deliberate, carrying the weight of not just her own life, but the weight of centuries pressing quietly on her shoulders. As she settled into the chair, 100 pairs of eyes bore into her. But Maya Thompson was ready, more ready than any of them could have possibly imagined. Maya adjusted the microphone in front of her, her hands steady, despite the sea of judgmental stares pressing in from all sides. The prosecutor, a lean man in his 50s named Paul Whitmore, stood ready to dismantle her credibility. But Maya met his gaze with the calm of someone who had walked into fire before and come out unburned. "Ms. Thompson," Whitmore began, his tone sharp. "Please explain your actions on the night of the incident." Maya leaned forward slightly. "I can," she said, voice even. "But first, I must clarify something. Officer Reynolds' version of events is not just inaccurate, it's intentionally misleading." A ripple moved through the spectators. Whitmore smirked, clearly savoring the moment. "That's a bold claim. Do you have proof?" Maya didn't blink. "The truth has a way of surfacing, counselor. You'll see." Judge Holloway tapped his pen against the bench, signaling for Whitmore to proceed. Maya inhaled quietly, steadying herself. "That night, I was coming home from a friend's place. I stopped briefly on Jefferson Avenue to check my GPS. I wasn't trespassing. I wasn't loitering. I was standing on a public sidewalk." Whitmore arched an eyebrow. "And you claim that Officer Reynolds approached you without cause?" "He approached me aggressively," Maya corrected, her voice firm but measured, pointed a flashlight in my face, demanded to know what I was doing. I asked why he needed to see my ID when I wasn't doing anything wrong. Murmurs stirred in the gallery. The undercurrent of doubt had begun. Whitmore pressed. "So you questioned his authority?" Maya's eyes didn't waver. "I questioned his intent. There's a difference." Judge Holloway rapped his gavel lightly for order as a few spectators whispered too loudly. Maya continued. "When I asked for clarification, Officer Reynolds accused me of being uncooperative. Before I could even finish speaking, he grabbed my arm." "Are you alleging that Officer Reynolds physically restrained you without justification?" Whitmore asked, trying to keep the skepticism out of his voice. "Yes," Maya answered without hesitation. "When I told him to release me, he squeezed tighter and said, and I quote, 'Women like you need to learn to obey.'" A sharp gasp cut through the room. Even Judge Holloway paused before banging his gavel harder. "Order!" he barked. Whitmore shook his head slightly, struggling to regain his momentum. "Ms. Thompson?" he said, voice strained. "Do you have any evidence supporting this claim?" Maya turned her eyes directly toward him, her voice low but clear. The body camera he was wearing that night conveniently malfunctioned. "Isn't that right, Officer Reynolds?" The courtroom shifted like a living thing, every head turning toward Reynolds, who now sat rigid, his earlier smugness evaporating. Whitmore coughed awkwardly. Let's stick to verified facts. Miss Thompson, after this alleged restraint, what happened next? I told him again to let go, Maya said evenly. When I pulled my arm away, he slammed me against his patrol car, handcuffed me, and accused me of assault. Whitmore stepped closer to the jury, voice rising slightly. Is it possible, Miss Thompson, that your strength or actions could have made Officer Reynolds feel threatened? Maya's lips tightened into something close to a smile. I am not stronger than a trained police officer. And for the record, I didn't use force until I had to protect my dignity. I didn't reach for his weapon. That accusation is pure fabrication. The room was thick with silence. Whitmore, looking increasingly cornered, crossed his arms. You expect this court to believe that Officer Reynolds, a decorated officer, fabricated an entire incident against you. A stranger. Maya's voice cut through the stillness like a blade. Not just against me, against what I represent. Whitmore opened his mouth to retort, but Judge Holloway interrupted. Miss Thompson, he said, voice low with interest. Are you suggesting there is evidence yet to be revealed? At the defense table, Andrew Lewis stood quickly. Your Honor, the defense will be presenting additional evidence shortly. Whitmore rolled his eyes dramatically. More stalling. Your Honor, if the defense had anything real, they would have shown it already. Maya turned her gaze toward the judge. The truth takes time, she said, each word deliberate. But once it's revealed, it will be undeniable. Judge Holloway studied her for a long moment before nodding. Court will reconvene tomorrow at 9:00 a.m. The gavel fell like a gunshot. The room exploded into a low roar of speculation. Maya stood, moving past Officer Reynolds without even glancing at him. His gaze flickered nervously toward her, and for the first time that day, Maya allowed herself the smallest flicker of satisfaction. Outside the courthouse, the late afternoon sun burned low and gold. Maya paused on the steps, inhaling deeply. The real battle hadn't even begun yet, but she was ready. She had always been ready. That evening, the courthouse emptied slowly. The tension of the day still clinging to the heavy stone walls, Maya descended the steps alone, the cool breeze tugging gently at the hem of her blouse. The crowd dispersed into the darkening streets, but she stood still, gazing at the horizon where the last traces of sunlight melted into deep blue. She had stayed composed all day, measured every word, every breath, but she knew the storm was far from over. Andrew Lewis caught up to her, his face flushed from stress, and the adrenaline still burning through his veins. Maya, he said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was within earshot. We need to talk. She turned to him, her posture still relaxed but her eyes sharp. What's on your mind, Andrew? He exhaled, his voice dropping even lower. You're holding back. The judge knows it. Whitmore knows it. And Officer Reynolds, he's starting to feel it too. Whatever you're keeping, I need to know. Now. Maya offered a small, almost imperceptible smile. You'll know soon enough. Andrew shook his head, frustrated. That's not good enough. I'm your attorney. If we're going to destroy him tomorrow, I need to be ready. For a moment, Maya just studied him, weighing the man who had stood by her despite everything. Finally, she nodded. Come to my place tonight. I'll tell you everything. Without waiting for a reply, she walked toward the parking lot, her silhouette a dark figure against the soft glow of the courthouse lanterns. Later that evening, Andrew parked his car outside Maya's modest home at the edge of town. Tall oak trees loomed around the property, their branches swaying in the night wind. The house was small but tidy, the porch light casting a welcoming circle of warmth onto the gravel driveway. When he knocked, the door opened immediately, as if she had been waiting. She wore a navy sweatshirt and jeans, her hair tied back simply, her face calm but serious. Come in, she said, stepping aside. Andrew entered cautiously, noting the sparse but neat decor, the folded American flag displayed on the mantel, the framed photo of a younger Maya standing beside an older man in matching military uniform, and a bookshelf lined with titles on leadership, survival, and resilience. "You live alone?" he asked, more out of habit than curiosity. "For now," she said simply, motioning for him to sit. "Drink." "No, thanks," he said, sitting stiffly at the edge of the couch, his briefcase still clutched tightly. "I'm here for the truth, Maya." She gave a slight nod and crossed the room to the bookshelf, pulling out a worn leather folder. It looked old, but well cared for, its edges soft from years of handling. She set it on the coffee table between them without ceremony. "This," she said, "is my full-service record." Andrew hesitated, then reached for it, flipping open the cover carefully. As he scanned the first few pages, his eyes widened. Discharge papers, commendations, mission certifications. "Wait," he muttered, flipping faster. "You were a Navy SEAL, Lieutenant Commander, retired," Maya confirmed, her voice steady. Andrew leaned back heavily, the weight of realization hitting him like a blow. "Maya, this changes everything. Why didn't you tell me before?" She sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap. "Because it's not just about who I was. It's about what this fight represents. It's about a system that lets men like Reynolds act without consequence. This is bigger than just clearing my name." Andrew shook his head slowly, trying to process it all. "Do you think Reynolds knows who you really are?" "Not yet," Maya said. "But he suspects something. You saw the way he looked at me today. He knows there's a piece he's missing, and it's gnawing at him." Andrew closed the folder, setting it gently back on the table. "What's the plan then?" Maya stood, moving toward the mantel where the folded flag sat in its case. She ran her fingers over the glass, her voice soft but fierce. "Tomorrow, we don't just reveal the truth. We remind them who they tried to silence. We show them what real strength looks like, not the kind that comes from a badge or a uniform, but the kind that comes from surviving everything they never even dreamed of facing." Andrew rose too, a slow, respectful movement. "Tomorrow," he said, a hint of a smile playing at his lips. "They're going to see you for who you really are." Maya turned to face him, the fire in her eyes unmistakable. "I'm not just fighting for myself anymore. Andrew, I'm fighting for every person who's ever been told to sit down, shut up, and take it. Tomorrow. We fight for all of them." The two stood there for a long moment, surrounded by the quiet dignity of her home, as outside the wind whispered through the trees and the night deepened, carrying with it the weight of what was about to come. The next morning, the courthouse loomed under a sky of muted gray, the early sun struggling to burn through the low-hanging mist. A crowd had already gathered on the steps, their breath rising in ghostly clouds as they jostled for position. News had spread like wildfire overnight. Today was no longer just about a simple courtroom proceeding. It had become an event, a reckoning. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with a nervous energy. Journalists filled the benches. Cameras flashed as spectators craned their necks for a glimpse of the woman at the center of it all. Maya Thompson sat at the defense table, her posture relaxed but alert, her navy blue blazer and crisp white shirt giving her an air of quiet authority. Beside her, Andrew Lewis shuffled his papers, tapping his pen anxiously against the table. But Maya remained still, a steady anchor in a rising tide of uncertainty. "You ready for this?" Andrew whispered, leaning slightly toward her. Maya didn't take her eyes off the judge's bench. "I've been ready a long time. Andrew, let's give them what they came for." The gavel slammed, silencing the room as Judge Holloway entered, his expression unreadable. "Court is now in session. We will continue with the matter of the state versus Maya Thompson." The prosecutor, Paul Whitmore, was already on his feet, his suit immaculate, his demeanor carefully composed. "Your Honor, the prosecution intends to reinforce Officer Reynolds' testimony today and present further evidence corroborating his claims." Maya caught the slight tremor in his voice despite his polished words. Judge Holloway nodded, and Whitmore called Reynolds back to the stand. Officer Reynolds rose slowly this time, his movements no longer casual but stiff, heavy with the burden of exposure. As he took the oath again, his gaze darted around the room, never once settling on Maya. Officer Reynolds. Whitmore began, his voice steady. Please remind the court of the events surrounding Ms. Thompson's arrest. Reynolds cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. As I stated previously, I encountered the defendant near a closed business. She was loitering. She refused to comply with lawful orders and acted aggressively when questioned. Whitmore nodded, trying to keep the momentum. And you stand by your account that Ms. Thompson attempted to reach for your weapon? Reynolds stiffened. Yes, I do. Andrew stood, buttoning his jacket before approaching the stand. His steps were deliberate, almost slow, each one adding to the tension squeezing the courtroom. Officer Reynolds. He began, his voice calm. You testified that my client acted aggressively and reached for your sidearm. Is that correct? Reynolds nodded sharply. Yes. Andrew tilted his head slightly. And yet, you claim that during this crucial moment, your body camera malfunctioned. That's correct, Reynolds said, his jaw tightening. A coincidence. Then, Andrew said softly, tell me, officer, in your 10 years on the force, how often has your body cam malfunctioned during an arrest? Reynolds hesitated just a second too long. Not often, but equipment failures happen. Andrew turned, pacing before the jury, each word measured, especially convenient when the evidence could have cleared everything up. Wouldn't you say? Whitmore rose to object, but Judge Holloway waved him down. Continue, Mr. Lewis. Andrew turned back to Reynolds. Were you aware, officer, that a bystander recorded the incident on their phone? A visible shudder passed through Reynolds' body. Around the courtroom, the tension thickened palpably. Bailiff, Judge Holloway said, his voice sharp. Play the footage. A screen flickered to life on the wall, and shaky footage appeared through the grainy frame of a car window. Reynolds' voice rang out sharp, aggressive. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Maya's voice followed, calm, firm. I'm not resisting. Let go of my arm. The room froze as the video showed Reynolds slamming Maya against the patrol car. His words unmistakable. Women like you don't get to question me. The courtroom erupted. Cries of outrage. Gasps of disbelief. The murmur of growing anger. Judge Holloway hammered his gavel repeatedly. Order, there will be order. When the chaos subsided, Andrew spoke again, his voice even lower, colder. Officer Reynolds, he said, fixing the man with a stare that pinned him to his seat. You just told this court under oath that my client acted aggressively, yet the footage shows otherwise. Care to explain? Reynolds opened his mouth, but no words came out. His face was pale, slick with sweat, his hands gripping the edge of the stand as if he could anchor himself to a version of reality that had already slipped away. No further questions, Andrew said, stepping back. Reynolds stumbled from the witness stand. His composure shattered. Even his fellow officers, once so solid in their silent support, avoided his gaze now. At the defense table, Maya remained composed. She leaned slightly toward Andrew, the foundations starting to crack. She whispered. Andrew nodded, a small smile tugging at his mouth. Let's bring the whole thing down. Judge Holloway turned to Andrew. Mr. Lewis, do you have any further evidence? Andrew stood without hesitation. Yes, Your Honor. The defense calls Maya Thompson to the stand. Maya rose, every movement deliberate, every step echoing with silent power. As she took the stand, the room leaned forward, hungry for what would come next. Andrew approached, his voice strong. Miss Thompson, please tell the court, in your own words, what happened that night. Maya met the gaze of the jury, the judge, and even the silent rows of officers at the back. I was coming home, she said, her voice steady. I stopped to check my phone. Officer Reynolds approached. He demanded identification without cause. When I asked why, he grew hostile. When I questioned his behavior, he grabbed me. When I resisted the violation of my rights, he escalated force. Andrew stepped closer. Did you ever attempt to reach for his weapon? No, Maya said without hesitation. Did you ever act aggressively? Only when defending myself against unlawful force? Andrew paced before the jury. There's been a lot of talk about who you are. Miss Thompson, is there something the court should know? Maya's gaze hardened slightly, her words slicing through the charged silence. Yes, I am Lieutenant Commander Maya Thompson, retired, United States Navy SEAL. I served this country for 20 years in some of the most hostile environments on Earth. I know what it means to face real threats. Officer Reynolds was not one. A collective gasp swept the room, followed by an oppressive silence. Even Judge Holloway leaned forward, his pen frozen above the docket. Andrew allowed the weight of her words to settle over the room before speaking. Thank you, Commander Thompson. No further questions. As Maya stepped down from the stand, the courtroom felt irreversibly altered, as though the ground beneath everyone's feet had shifted. Reynolds slumped in his seat, his hands trembling, his face drained of blood. The truth had cracked the facade wide open, and Maya Thompson had only just begun. The air inside the courtroom grew heavier with every passing second. Officer Reynolds sat rigid at the plaintiff's table, his composure disintegrating by degrees. The once proud uniform seemed to weigh him down now. The badge on his chest, no longer a symbol of authority, but an anchor dragging him deeper into disgrace. His hands, once steady, now fidgeted visibly under the table, betraying the unraveling nerves he could no longer hide. Behind him, the silent ranks of fellow officers exchanged uneasy glances, their previous confidence in him giving way to doubt, suspicion, even quiet shame. Judge Holloway leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed squarely on Reynolds. Mr. Whitmore, he said, his voice edged with something almost resembling warning. Does the prosecution intend to proceed with redirect? Whitmore rose stiffly, straightening his tie with a twitchy hand. Yes, Your Honor, he replied, though the words lacked the conviction he had worn at the start of this trial. Turning to Reynolds, he forced a tight smile. Officer Reynolds, he began, you've heard the testimony of Ms. Thompson. Do you wish to respond? Reynolds cleared his throat, a dry rasp scraping from his chest. Yes, he said, but his voice cracked, lacking the bravado that once filled the room. Her account is exaggerated. I acted within the scope of my duties. Whitmore nodded encouragingly, desperate to salvage something from the wreckage. And the video footage presented earlier, how do you explain it? Reynolds hesitated, his mouth opening and closing once before sound emerged. The video doesn't show everything. It's out of context. She was defiant. She resisted. Whitmore seized on the words, pressing forward. So you stand by your claim that she attempted to reach for your service weapon? Yes, Reynolds said, but the word rang hollow, stripped of all force. Andrew Lewis rose smoothly to his feet. Your Honor, the defense requests immediate cross-examination. Judge Holloway nodded curtly. Proceed. Andrew approached Reynolds with a calm, deliberate gait, his every movement broadcasting quiet confidence. He stood a few feet from the stand, letting the silence stretch until Reynolds, unable to bear it, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Officer Reynolds, Andrew said, his voice smooth but edged with steel. You've insisted multiple times that my client attempted to seize your weapon, yet you have offered no physical evidence, no fingerprints, no scuffle marks, no corroborating witnesses, just your word. Reynolds swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. I know what I saw, he muttered. Andrew nodded, as if considering it carefully. You know what you saw, he repeated softly. And yet, the court has seen something very different. A woman who remained calm, who asked for an explanation, who was manhandled without cause. Whitmore objected, but Judge Holloway waved him off impatiently. The defense may continue. Andrew leaned slightly closer, his voice dropping to a cold whisper that still carried across the courtroom. Tell me, Officer Reynolds, does it embarrass you to know that the woman you tried to intimidate has faced dangers in real combat zones that you couldn't even imagine surviving? Reynolds flinched visibly, his face flushing red. That's irrelevant, he barked, his control slipping further. Andrew pounced. Irrelevant, he echoed, turning to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, this man wants you to believe that a decorated Navy SEAL, a lieutenant commander who spent 2 decades defending the freedoms he now tramples, suddenly became a violent criminal because she dared to question him on a public sidewalk. The jury watched in rapt attention. Their expressions hardened. Skeptical, Reynolds looked like a man drowning, and every word Andrew spoke pushed his head further under. No further questions, Andrew said crisply. Stepping back, Reynolds stumbled down from the stand. No longer a figure of authority, but a broken man in a uniform too heavy to bear. At the defense table, Maya sat unmoving, her presence alone seeming to press against the walls of the courtroom, a silent testament to resilience, to truth. Andrew leaned toward her, voice low. The walls are collapsing. Maya. She nodded once, her eyes never leaving Reynolds's bowed head. Let's finish this. Around them, the gallery remained hushed, every spectator sensing that the final blow was imminent. Justice was no longer a question of if, it was a matter of when. The courtroom buzzed with a tension so thick it felt almost tangible. Every seat was filled. Every pair of eyes locked either on Maya or the crumbling figure of Officer Reynolds. Judge Holloway adjusted his glasses, his stern gaze sweeping the room before settling on Andrew Lewis. Mr. Lewis, he said, voice low but commanding. You may proceed with your next evidence. Andrew rose slowly. The confidence he radiated now sharpened to a razor's edge. He retrieved a thin file from his briefcase, holding it up for the jury to see. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice steady. What you've witnessed today is a glimpse into a system that shields misconduct under a veil of authority. But today, the veil lifts. He approached the bench and handed the file to the bailiff, who distributed copies to the jurors. Contained in these pages are Officer Reynolds's internal disciplinary records. Andrew continued, pivoting to address the courtroom. Records that until now were hidden behind departmental red tape. Paul Whitmore shot to his feet. Objection. Your Honor, this is prejudicial. Judge Holloway raised a hand, silencing him. Overruled. Continue. Mr. Lewis. Andrew nodded, turning back to the jury. What these documents reveal is not an isolated incident. Over the past 7 years, Officer Reynolds has been the subject of multiple complaints: excessive force, racial profiling, improper conduct, all buried, all dismissed without thorough investigation. A ripple of shock ran through the courtroom. Reynolds sat frozen, his face a ghastly shade of white, his knuckles gripping the table so tightly that they seemed to leach the blood from his hands. Andrew let the silence hang, heavy and damning. And yet, despite this pattern, he said, voice dropping to a deadly calm, he was allowed to continue wearing a badge until he crossed paths with someone he couldn't intimidate, someone who knew how to fight back, not with violence, but with truth. Maya sat immobile at the defense table, her presence radiating an unshakable calm that only deepened the impact of Andrew's words. Judge Holloway leaned forward slightly, a rare flicker of emotion disgust, perhaps crossing his features. Whitmore remained rooted to his chair, visibly defeated. Andrew paced slowly before the jury, lowering his voice so that the entire room leaned in to catch every word. The prosecution would have you believe this is about an officer doing his duty under difficult circumstances, but it's not. It's about an officer abusing his power. It's about a woman being profiled, restrained, humiliated not because she posed a threat, but because she dared to ask why. He stopped, letting his final words hang in the silent room. Ask yourselves, Who do you believe, the decorated Navy SEAL who spent 20 years defending this nation, or the man who thought no one would dare to challenge his lie? Andrew returned to the defense table without another word. The impact had been delivered. There was no need to say more. Judge Holloway cleared his throat, his voice heavy. The court will now recess before closing arguments. Jury members are instructed to consider the evidence carefully. As the judge banged the gavel, the courtroom erupted in whispers. Journalists scribbled furiously. Spectators leaned across benches to exchange hushed words. But Maya remained still, a pillar of quiet strength amid the storm. Andrew leaned toward her, voice low but filled with the tremor of adrenaline. That was the hammer blow. Maya, we've shattered him. She allowed herself the faintest nod, her gaze unwavering. It wasn't just him we shattered, she said quietly. It was the lie he stood on. Outside, the gray skies remained heavy and low, mirroring the weight that still pressed on the courthouse walls. The final battle wasn't over yet, but the tide had turned, and the truth, once buried deep, was now roaring to the surface, unstoppable. The courtroom filled again after recess, the buzz of whispered conversations still lingering as people settled into their seats. Every eye in the room was drawn to the defense table where Maya Thompson sat poised, calm, her very presence a silent declaration that no matter how the trial ended, she had already reclaimed her dignity. Across the room, Officer Reynolds sat hunched over, his uniform wrinkled, his expression hollow. Gone was the smug arrogance of earlier days. Now, he looked like a man awaiting inevitable judgment. Judge Holloway entered, his expression even grimmer than before. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, voice heavy. "You may proceed with your closing argument." Whitmore rose stiffly, straightening his jacket as though trying to shake off the pall that had fallen over the prosecution. He approached the jury, his smile thin and strained. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice lacking its earlier conviction. "We must remember that law enforcement officers operate under intense pressure. Mistakes can be made, but that does not necessarily mean malicious intent." He gestured weakly toward Reynolds. Officer Reynolds believed he was acting appropriately. "I ask you to consider the circumstances, not simply the outcome." He spoke for several more minutes, but his words fell flat. The jury remained stone-faced, unmoved. Even some of the spectators looked away, unimpressed. When Whitmore returned to his seat, it was with the air of a man who knew he had already lost. Judge Holloway turned to Andrew Lewis. "Defense may present closing arguments." Andrew rose, buttoning his jacket, and approached the jury with a measured pace that commanded attention. His voice, when it came, was strong and clear, slicing through the tension like a blade. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, meeting each juror's gaze in turn, "this case is not complicated. It is not about a split-second decision made under duress. It is about power, who holds it, and how it can be abused when left unchecked." He pointed briefly toward Maya. "Maya Thompson is not just a veteran. She is not just a decorated Navy SEAL. She is a citizen who deserved the same respect and protection under the law as anyone else. And yet, she was treated like a threat simply because she asked a question." He stepped closer, lowering his voice to an intense whisper that forced the entire courtroom to lean in. Officer Reynolds thought no one would believe her over him. He counted on the badge, on the uniform, to shield him. But today, the truth has spoken louder than any badge. A ripple of energy stirred the jury. Andrew pressed on, his voice swelling with righteous force. Accountability is not anti-police. It is pro-justice. It is what separates a democracy from tyranny. Today, you have the chance to affirm that truth matters, that justice matters, that no one, not even a man with a badge, is above the law. He let the final words hang in the heavy air before nodding respectfully and returning to the defense table. A hush fell over the room as Judge Holloway gave instructions to the jury. Then, they were dismissed to deliberate. Maya sat motionless as the jurors filed out, her hands folded loosely on the table, her head held high. Across the room, Reynolds sat slumped, his face buried in his hands. Time dragged as they waited. the minutes stretching into an unbearable silence. Andrew paced. Maya remained still, her mind anchored in a place beyond fear, beyond anger, only resolve. Finally, the bailiff returned, his face grave. "The jury has reached a verdict," he announced. The courtroom filled instantly, everyone holding their breath as the jurors took their seats. The forewoman stood, a piece of paper trembling slightly in her hands. "In the matter of the state versus Maya Thompson," she said, voice clear despite the tension, "we find the defendant not guilty on all charges." A collective gasp rippled through the room, followed by a smattering of relieved sighs and muffled cheers before the judge's gavel brought them to order. Maya closed her eyes briefly, allowing herself a single moment of quiet victory. Andrew squeezed her shoulder gently. The forewoman continued, her voice unwavering. "Furthermore, the jury recommends an immediate investigation into Officer Reynolds' conduct." Judge Holloway nodded solemnly. "This court will move forward accordingly. Officer Reynolds," he said, turning his cold gaze toward the fallen officer. "You may want to retain legal counsel. Your troubles are far from over." Reynolds shrank further into his seat, the weight of his impending downfall pressing visibly on his shoulders. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed the steps, cameras flashing wildly as Maya emerged into the cold afternoon light. She paused, scanning the crowd, then stepped to the microphone. "This was never just my fight," she said, her voice firm, carrying over the crowd. "This was a fight for anyone who has been silenced, overlooked, or mistreated by those entrusted to protect them. Accountability is not an attack on justice, it is its foundation." Applause erupted as she turned and walked away, not with the swagger of someone basking in victory, but with the unshakable dignity of a soldier who had fought one more battle and refused to be broken. Behind her, Officer Reynolds faced the wreckage of his lies, alone. The courthouse emptied slowly, but the echoes of the verdict lingered like a powerful aftershock. Maya Thompson descended the wide stone steps surrounded by a flurry of reporters, their microphones thrust forward, their questions sharp and relentless. But she said little more, offering only a few words about justice and dignity before making her way through the crowd, her steps purposeful, her face calm. Behind her, Andrew Lewis watched, his chest swelling with a quiet pride. This wasn't just a courtroom victory. It was a moment that would ripple far beyond these walls. In the days that followed, the news spread like wildfire. Media outlets picked up Maya's story, painting her not just as a survivor of injustice, but as a symbol of resilience. Headlines hailed her as the veteran who fought back, the SEAL who stood alone, the woman who exposed the system. Interviews flooded in, but Maya chose carefully, speaking only to outlets that focused on the broader issue rather than sensationalizing her personal ordeal. She wasn't interested in fame, she was interested in change. Meanwhile, the walls around Officer Reynolds continued to crumble. The department launched an internal review that quickly uncovered a damning pattern of misconduct long ignored. Old complaints that had been quietly buried resurfaced. Reynolds was placed on administrative leave, but it didn't last. Within a month, he was dismissed from the force. Worse still, he faced criminal charges for perjury, obstruction of justice, and civil rights violations. Once a man certain of his untouchable status, he now stood where Maya had once been, at the mercy of a system he no longer controlled. In the midst of the chaos, Maya found herself drawn into a new battle not for herself, but for others like her. She began working with advocacy groups focused on police reform, speaking at community meetings, mentoring young people who had lost faith in justice. Her name became a rallying cry, not because she sought it, but because she embodied it. Quietly, she used the settlement money awarded from a subsequent civil suit to start a foundation aimed at supporting victims of wrongful arrests and systemic abuse. One cold evening several months after the trial, Maya stood outside a small community center on the east side of town, the neighborhood where her ordeal had begun. The center had just opened a new wing dedicated to education and outreach programs, funded largely by Maya's efforts. Andrew joined her, hands tucked into his coat pockets against the chill. "You know," he said, his voice low, "you could have just walked away after the trial." no one would have blamed you. Maya smiled faintly, her eyes tracing the center's brightly lit windows. Walking away was never an option. She replied, justice doesn't end with a verdict. It's a fight you choose every day. Andrew nodded, understanding more than he could say. They're lucky to have you, he said after a moment. The whole town is... Maya didn't answer right away. She watched as children laughed and played inside the building, their lives untouched, for now, by the battles she had fought. That was what made it worth it. Not the headlines, not the public recognition. The simple, precious gift of safety, dignity, and hope. Later, as she drove home under a velvet sky spangled with stars, Maya reflected on the strange path her life had taken, from the battlefields overseas to the quiet warfare of a courtroom, from a uniformed soldier to an advocate for change. She hadn't chosen this fight. It had chosen her. And if it came again, if the call for justice rang out once more, she would answer without hesitation. Because for Maya Thompson, justice wasn't just something she believed in. It was something she lived. It was, and always would be, the core of who she was.